All right, Appendix B, Federal Administrative dot Part 240, Appendix D. We are at we're at the Qualification and Certification of Locomotive Engineers, Part 240. And we're starting out at Appendix B. Appendix B to the Part 240 procedures of submission and approval of locomotive engineering qualification programs. The appendix establishes procedure submission and approval of the railroad program concerning the training, testing, evaluation persons seeking certification, recertification as a locomotive engineer in accordance with the requirements of this part. See statute 240 101, 240 103, 240 105, 240 107, 240 123, 240 125, 240 127, 240 129. It also contains guidance of the Federal Railroad Administrative exercise to review, approval, and responsibility. Submission by a railroad is provided by the 240-101. Each railroad must have a program determination of the qualifications of each person as it permits, requires to operate the locomotive, designates it is program regulated. Railroad must be taken account of the trackage determination within the operates of the system. The train controllers are employed at the operation, design, characteristics of the track equipment being operated, including train length, train making up, train speed. Each railroad must substitute individual program to the Federal Railroad Administrative approval for the section for 240-103. Each of the program must be accompanied by the request for the approval organized in accordance with the appendix, requesting for the approval for the containing appropriate references to the relevant portion of the program being discussed. The request should be submitted in writing. The standardized requests shall be submitted in writing. Standardized size paper 8.5 by 11 can be written in letter and narrative format. The railroad submission shall be sent to Associate Administrator for the Safety of the Federal Railroad. Mailing address of the Federal Railroad is 407th Street, the Southwest Washington, D.C. 20590. So what I'm going to do is each railroad program determine the qualifications of each person that requires to operate the locomotive. That's an SCRR. It designates the program which are to achieve the accountable trackage, terrain, and other operating system, the train track, employed operating design characteristics, track and equipment being operated in the train length, train makeup, and train speeds. Each railroad is submit an individual program for the Federal Railroad. So I'm going to write a program for the railroad to the FFRIA, and I'm going to provide it with the 241 for approval. Each program accompanied with a request approval organized in accordance with the appendix. With this appendix, Part B, request the approval for the appropriate reference for the relevant program discussed, and the request should be submitted in writing on standardized 8.5 by 11.5 sheet paper that can be lettered or narrative filed. The railroad submission shall be sent to the Associate Administrator of the Safety Federal Railroad. Mailing address of the 50 Federal Railroad is in 407th Street in South Washington, D.C. 20590. All right, in organization of submission, each request should be organized and present the record information following the standardized manner. Each section must begin with given name, title, telephone number, and mailing address of the person that contacted concerning the materials addressed in the section. If person identified with the prior section sufficient to merely repeat the person's name in the subsequent section. Subsection 1 of the submission, general information of the elections. Okay, section 1 of submissions, general information and elections. First section of the request must contain the name of the railroad, the person that may be contacted with the request, including the person's names, title, telephone number, mailing address. As a statement electing either the acceptable or responsible educating previously untrained persons, qualified locomotive engineers to recertify. Only engineers previously certified by the other railroads or C240-103. If the railroad elects not to conduct the training or a person not previously trained to become a locomotive engineer, the railroad is not obligated to submit information on how the previously untrained will be trained. A railroad that makes election limited to recertifying the person initially certified by another railroad initially elects to accept the responsibility of training its own locomotive engineers can resign in initial election by a railroad that is initially elects to not accept responsibility for training or its own locomotive engineers can rescind the initial election by obtaining Federal Railroad Administration approval for the modification of this program. If we're still in section 1 of the submissions of general information and elections. If a railroad elects to accept responsibility for conducting the education of the person not previously trained but to be a locomotive engineer, the railroad is obligated to submit the information on how such will be trained, but has no duty actually to conduct such a training. A railroad that elects accepting accountability. A railroad that elects to accept responsibility for the training of such person must authorize another railroad for non-railroad entities to perform actual training effort. So a railroad that elects accepting responsibility training such as person authorizes another railroad non-railroad entity to perform an actual training effort. The election and railroad remains responsible for the assuring of such the training provides adhere to the training program the railroad submits. The section must also state the class or the class of service for the railroad will employ. Section 2, the submission, selection of supervisors and locomotive engineers. The second section is the request and must contain the information concerning the railroad procedure. Selecting the person, it will rely on the evaluated knowledge, skills, or ability to proceed seeking the certification, recertification as provided in 240-105. Each of the railroad must have the procedure seeking supervisors for locomotive engineers, which assure the person is so designated that can appropriately test, evaluate knowledge, skill, ability individuals seeking certification, recertification. Section 240-105 provides the railroad latitude to select the critical elevation methodology. It will rely on the determination which the person or persons have the required capacity performing supervisor locomotive engineers. The railroad must be described the section how it will use the latitude evaluation. Those that designated as supervisor locomotive engineers are able to comply with the performance standards set of the 240-105. The railroad must identify in sufficient detail to permit effective review of the Federal Railroad. The critical evaluation is selected for the example the railroad intends to rely on one or more of the following: minimum level of prior experience of the engineer is successful completion of the course of study, selection of passages and standardized testing program. By submission must state the criteria will employ. Section 3, submission, training person previously certified. They're certified. This section request must contain information concerning the railroad's program previously certified locomotive engineers provided by the in 240-1023. Each railroad must have the program ongoing education of the locomotive engineers to ensure the maintaining and necessary knowledge concerning the personal safety, operating rules, practices, mechanical condition, equipment, method of safe training and handling, including the military physical characteristics and relevant federal safety studies. Section 240-123 provides a railroad latitude to select the specific subject matter to convert during the Section 240-123 provides a railroad latitude to select a specific subject matter to be converted to duration training method presenting information frequency on which the training will be provided. The railroad must describe in this section how it will use its latitude to ensure the engineers can remain knowledgeable, knowing the safe discharge of their training operation responsibilities so to comply with the performance standards set forth by the 240-123. The section must convey sufficient detail to permit the effective evaluation of railroad training programs in terms of subject matter and frequency and duration trainings in a session. The training environment employed for the example is used in the classroom for the use of a computer based on training, use of simulators, use of film, other slides, presentations, use of on-the-job training, for which except for the program, the voluntary and mandatory safe train handling involves both the abstract knowledge of the appropriate use of the engine controls application knowledge to train different composition transfer, varying terrain, time, and circumstances having capable of diminishing both the abstract knowledge and the proper application of the knowledge in discrete events. Time circumstances also have the capacity to value previously owned knowledge. Time and circumstances also have capacity to alter the value of the previously obtained knowledge and application of the knowledge. In formulating how it will use the discretionary be afforded, each railroad must design a program address with both the loss of retention knowledge and charge in the circumstances section for the submission of Federal Railroad Administration must address these matters. For example, the locomotive engineer need to have the fundamental knowledge of the train operations refreshed periodically. Each railroad needs advice to the Federal Railroad Administrator how the need is satisfied in the interval between the attendance of such training and the nature of the training may be provided in methods of conducting the training. A matter of particular concern of the Federal Railroad is how each the railroad acts to assure the two engineers remain in knowledgeable. once again, the last sentence was a matter of particular concern of the Federal Railroad Administration how each of the railroad acts to ensure that engineers remain knowledgeable about the safe and training procedures of the territory over the local mode of engineering that is authorized to operate the territory from the engineer has been in absence. The railroad must have the plan for familiarization training for the address the question of how long a person can be absent before needing more education. Once the threshold is reached, however, the person acquires the need educational similar program must be addressed by the railroad, responding to charges such as introduction, new technology, new operating rule books, significant changes in operation, including alteration territory engineers authorized to operate over. Section 4 of submission, testing and evaluation person previously certified. A force of the section of the request must be containing information concerning the railroad program, the testing and evaluation previously certified locomotive engineer as provided by the 240-125, 240-127. Each of the railroad have the program of the ongoing testing and evaluation of its locomotive and to ensure that they have necessary knowledge and skills concerning the personnel safety, operating rules, and practice, mechanical condition of equipment, methods of safety training, handling, familiarity, physical characteristics, relevant federal safety laws. Similarly, each of the railroad must have the program out for an ongoing testing evaluation to ensure that the locomotive engineers have necessary vision and hearing acuity provided by the 240-121, Section 240-125 and 240-127 require that the railroad rely on a written procedure determined on that each person can demonstrate that him or her knowledge of the railroad rules, practice, skills as applying these rules, practice, safety, operation, locomotive. The training for Section 240-125 directs that when seeking to demonstrate the person's knowledge, a railroad must employ the written test that contains the objective questions and answers covers the following subject matters: 1. Personal safety practices. 2. Operating practices. 3. Equipment inspection practices. 4. Training handle practices. 5. Including familiarity with physical characteristics. Training handling practices, including familiarity with physical characteristics of territory. Compliance with relevant federal safety and testing must accurately measure the person's knowledge of all these areas. Section 240-125 provides the railroad latitude selecting the design of their own testing policies, including a number. Section 240-125 provides the latitude of the selecting of the design of its own testing policy, including the number of the questions each of the tests will contain, how each of the required subject matter will be covered, weighting if any be given to the particular subject matter, response selection and passing the scores, and of the manner presenting the testing information. The railroad must describe in this section how it will be used the latitude to assure that engineers will demonstrate their knowledge concerning the safety discharge of the train operating responsibility so that it complies with the performance standards set forth in 240-125. The Section 240-127 directs when seeking the demonstration of the personal skill, the railroad must employ the testing evaluation procedures conducting the designated supervisor of locomotive engineers. Alright, so Section 240-127 directs the seeking of the demonstration of the person's skills. A railroad must employ a test evaluation procedure conducting a designated supervisor of locomotive engineers. This contains an objective evaluation of the person's skills applying the railroad rules, practice, safety, operation, training. The training evaluation procedures must examine the person's skills in terms of all the following subject matters: 1. Operating. 2. Handling, inspection practices. 3. Train handling practices, including familiarity with physical characteristics of the territory. 4. Compliance with the relevant federal safety rules. The test must sufficiently effectively examine the person skillfully operating the train. Must demand a typical service of the person likely to encounter a normal course of events, and that he or she is deemed qualified. 240-127 provided the railroad latitude in selecting and designing of its own test evaluating procedure, including the duration of the evaluation process, how each of the required subject matter will be covered, weighting if any of the given a particular subject matter, responding, selecting the passing scores, the manner of the presenting the test information. The section should provide information concerning the procedures the railroad will follow, the achieving objectives described in Federal Railroad Administration, recommended objectives described in Federal Railroad Amended Practices. See Appendix 4. The conducting skills of the performance tests skills. The section gives a railroad latitude to employ either a Type 1, Type 2 simulator properly programmed to conduct the testing evaluation procedures. Alright, so this section also The section provides information concerning the procedure of the railroad following achieving the objectives described in the Federal Railroad Administration for the practices of see Appendix E, which we'll get to for the conducting skills of the performance testing. This section should also give the railroad latitude to employ either Type 1 or Type 2 simulator. Promptly programmed for the conduct of the testing evaluation procedure, railroad must describe its own section how it will use the latitude to ensure the engineer demonstrating the skills concerning the self-discharge of the training operation responsibility so that they comply with the performance standards sets forth in 240-127. Section 240-121 provides a railroad latitude to rely on professional medical option. The railroad medical examiner concerns the ability of the person to standard acuity to safety the operate a locomotive. The railroad must describe in this section how it will assure the medical examiners sufficient information concerning the railroad operations effective to appropriate conclusion with the ability to particular individual safely operate the train. Section 5. Training and testing evaluation persons not previously certified. Here we go, Section 5 of submissions. Training, testing, and evaluation persons not previously certified. Unless a railroad has election for the acceptable responsibility conducting initial training for the person of the locomotive engineers, the fifth section is the request may contain information concerning the railroad program, education, testing, and evaluation person previously trained with locomotive engineers. As provided by the Ford in 240-123, the railroad issuing initial and certification to the person to be locomotive engineer must have the program for the training, testing, evaluation as locomotive engineer to ensure they acquire necessary knowledge, skill concerning personnel safety, operating rules, practices, mechanical condition of the equipment, methods of safety handling, including familiarity with the physical characteristics relevant to federal safety rules. 240-123, establish a performance standards given to the railroad latitude in selecting it, how it will meet these standards. Railroad must describe the section on how it will be used the latitude to assure the engineers will acquire the sufficient knowledge and skills in demonstrating their knowledge and skills concerning the safety discharge of the train operating responsibility. The section must contain a level of the details describing this. This section must contain the same level of detail concerning the initial training program as described for each of the components of the overall paragraph contained by the Section 2 through 4. This appendix of the railroad that plans to accept responsibility for the initial training. Locomotive engineers must authorize another railroad or non-railroad entity to perform actual training efforts that authorized railroad may submit training program developed and authorized training for the authorized railroads the authorized railroad may submit training program developed, but the authorization railroad may submit a training program developed by the authorized trainer, but the authorized railroad remains responsible for assuring that such other training providers adhere to the training program submitted. Railroads that elect to rely on entities to conduct training away from the railroad's own tracks. Railroads that elect to rely on entities that conduct training away from the railroad's own tracks must indicate how the student will be provided with required familiarization with the physical characteristics for its trackage. Section 6 of Submission Monitoring Operational and Performance Certified Engineers. Final section of the request must be containing information concerning the railroad programs by monitoring the operation certified locomotive engineer as provided in 240-129. Each railroad must have the program ongoing monitoring of locomotive engineer to ensure that the operating locomotive is in conformity with the railroad operating rules practices, including method of safety training, safe train handling, and relevant federal safety rules. Section 240-129 requires the railroad annually observe each locomotive engineer demonstrating that his or her knowledge of the railroad rules and practices skills and applying for the rules practices of the safe operation locomotive of the train. Section 240-129 directs observation of the conducting designated supervisor locomotive engineers, provides that a railroad latitude the selection and design of its own observation procedures, including duration observation processes, reliance on tapes record of specifics of train operation, specific aspects, engineering performance to be covered. A section also gives them that latitude to employ either a Type 1, Type 2 simulator properly programmed to conduct the monitoring observations. The railroad must describe the section on how it will latitude to assure that the railroad monitoring is an engineer demonstrated that the skills concerning the safe discharge of the training operation responsibility of railroad then test they employ the training operation event record tapes that employ the monitoring requirements shall indicate the section on how to be anticipated determining the persons who was controlled within signal indications of other operational constraints, if any, of the application for the train movement. All right, Section 7, submission. Procedures of routine administration of engineering certification program. Procedure routine administration of an engineering certification program. The final section request must contain a summary how the railroad program procedures, the implementation of various specifically aspects of regularity, provisions relative to routine administration certification program, locomotive engineer. At a minimum, the section needs to address the procedural aspects of the rule provisions identified in the following paragraph. 240.109 provides each of the railroad must have the procedure to review the commandment of virtually prior safety conduct, but always the railroad to devise its own safety with generalized parameters. Section 241.15, 241.17, 241.19 require railroads procedure for evaluating data concerning the safety conduct of the motor vehicle operator and railroad workers, yet leave the section of the many details of the railroad. Section 242.03, 240.17, 219 place the duty of the railroad to make series of determinations but allowed to select procedures to employ as assured of the necessary determinations that have been in timely fashion will and be authorized to conclude that the person is or is not qualified. How it will communicate with diverse decisions, documentation of the factual basis of the railroad relied on the making of the determinations. 242.09, 240.11, 240.13 is required, but the section permits the railroad to select the procedures it will employ to accomplish compliance with the provision. Section 240.25, 240.227 permits the reliance of the qualification determines made of the other entities permit railroad latitude selection of the procedures employed. They assure the compliance with the provision. Similarity 242.29 of the permits the railroad selected the procedures that meet the requirements. Certification of engineers providing the service of the joint operation of the territory. Section 243.01, 243.07 allowing the railroad certain degree of the discretion in complying with the railroad requirements for replacing the lost certificate. Section 240.301, 240.307 will allow railroads to a certain degree of discretion comply with the requirements of the replacing lost certificates and conducting certification revocation proceedings. The section of this request should outline the summary fashion of the manner in which the railroad will implement the program so that to comply with the specific aspects of each of the rule provisions described in preceding paragraph. Okay, the Federal Railroad Administration. The submissions made in conformity with the appendix will be deemed approved within 30 days after the required filing date. Actual filing date with whichever is no formal approval documented issued with the Federal Railroad Administration. Brief interval review reflects the FRA judgment for the railroad generally are already having existing programs. We'll start again. The submission made by the conformity of the appendix will be deemed approved in 30 days after required filing date. Actual filing date, whichever is later. No formal approval will be issued to the FRA. The brief interview with the relief flag reflects Federal Railroad Administrative judgment of the railroad generally already having existing programs that will meet the requirements of this part. The Federal Railroad has taken the responsibility notifying the railroad of the text of the problem with the railroad programs. Federal Railroad retains the right to disapproval of the program obtained with the approval of the passage of the time is provided in Section 241.03. The Federal Railroad initially proposed the specifically details of the most aspects of the programs being submitted, but under this appendix, the proposed contained a delineation of the essential elements of pre-existing training, testing, evaluation, monitoring program for the period of the result in the railroads having locomotives engineers who operate locomotives and train safely. The proposed rule contained the very specific details for each of the aspects per program that appeared to contribute to that result. The details include such things as duration classes intended to teach operating rules, as well as interval methodology and acquiring familiarization with physical characteristics of engineering operational territory. Requests commenting the proposed rule did not question the validity of the Federal Railroad views concerning essential elements of the effective program, but did convince the Federal Railroad Administration that they should be given the discretion to formulate the design of their individual programs, rather than establish rigid requirements for each of the element program initially proposed by the Federal Railroad has been given the discretion. To select and design individual programs with specified context for each of the elements. The proposed rule, however, that provides a good guide of the consideration should be addressed in designing a program that will meet the performance standards of the final rule. The reviewing of the program submission of the FRA will focus on the degree to which the particular program deviates from the normal, identifying the proposed rule. This degree, particular program submission material deviates the form from normal set of the out. And in proposed rule was published in Federal Registry on December 11th, 1989. 54 for FR 50809 50890 Federal Registry 54 50890 in December 11th, 1981. The Federal Railroad Administration reviews and approval process focused on determining the validity, reason relied on the railroad selecting the alternative approach. The degree of the alternative approach is likely to be achieved with producing locomotive engineers whose knowledge and skills ability to safely operate and to train. Section C, parts of procedure obtaining evaluation motor vehicle driving record.